When a dashing officer and a beautiful deputy jailer join forces, it seems like a match made in heaven.
I think they had an attraction because they both worked in law enforcement.
He was sort of this charming guy, so they started dating, and I think she fell pretty hard.
But just when their lives seem destined for greatness, an unexpected disappearance upends their world.
There was a buzz in the city about a missing police officer.
We knew something bad probably gonna come after this.
As investigators search for answers, they'll soon find themselves plunged into uncharted waters. A place where secrets bubble just under the surface and deadly sins flow like blood.
There are drugs, there's a lot of criminal activity. Officers are often the targets of bad people.
His one vice was probably that he liked women a little too well.
He's coming towards her, and that's when it happens.
It just was a bad situation. Never should have happened.
They got away with a capital murder.
Monday, September 4th, 2006. It's Labor Day weekend in Memphis, Tennessee. All across town, families are enjoying end-of-summer barbecues. But at the home of Ethel Hayes, the absence of her beloved son, Tony, a 9-year veteran of the Memphis Police Department, is putting a damper on the festivities.
He hasn't contacted any of you and said he wasn't coming?
I hadn't talked to him today, but last I heard, he said he was coming.
He has been picking up his son and bring him to the barbecue too. And he never did show up.
That kind of alarmed the family that he didn't pick his son up because there are certain things Tony would not do, and not picking up his son was one of them. He loved his son very much.
Over the next few hours, Tony's family continues to try to track him down.
Did he answer?
Every time I call, I just get the voicemail. I'm telling you, something's not right. It's not right.
My grandma was start calling everybody that she knew that knew Tony and see could they get in touch with him.
No one knew where Tony was.
But the disappearance of Officer Tony Hayes is a mystery that's only beginning to unfold. One that'll have many wondering just who in this story was on the wrong side of the law.
We was just saying, wow, how could something happen like this? Everything was just crazy.
Tony Hayes was born in 1969 in the new Chicago neighborhood of Memphis, Tennessee.
It was a low-income neighborhood, but there was a sense of pride in the community. Even though it was low income, my parents instilled values in us.
Values that the whole Hayes family took to heart.
The Hayes family was a very loving, caring family. Mother Hayes, she did not play with her children. They knew that she was their friend, but she was also the law in that household.
In this strict yet caring environment, Tony grew up to be a model citizen.
He was just a very disciplined person.
After high school, Tony went off to the Marine Corps. He served his country during the Persian Gulf War, and I think maybe saw himself becoming a law enforcement officer.
A dream that came true after Tony left the Marine Corps and returned home to Memphis.
When Tony became a Memphis police officer, that was a sense of pride and accomplishment for him.
For the next 9 years, Tony worked some of the most dangerous beats in the city.
Tony was an undercover cop. He do his job to the fullest, and he was a hard worker.
He ultimately arose to the rank of sergeant and was proud of that accomplishment, as was his family.
But Tony's success in life extended well beyond the workplace.
No guys, I'm gonna go there.
He also fared well with the ladies.
Good evening, ladies. How you doing?
He was about 6'1" in height and very athletically built. And it was all muscle, and it wasn't no fat. He wore nice clothes, and he was a car enthusiast. So, he loved cars. He always had a nice car and kept himself up. So like I said, the ladies probably found Tony very attractive.
Like his prized cars, Tony had a soft spot for beautiful women. And over the next few years, he married twice.
He met his first wife after he got out of the military. She was drop-dead gorgeous, as was his second wife.
Though both marriages ended in divorce, there was a silver lining.
Even though the breakups were hard, Tony's second wife blessed him with a son, and that son became the light of his life.
He was very crazy about his son. It looked like he was Tony's mini-me.
He was an excellent father, spent a lot of time with his son, and really provided a great role model for that young man.
Though Tony was a loving father, he longed to have a woman in his life to help him raise young Devin. And in the spring of 2005, Tony met the drop-dead gorgeous 36-year-old Monique Johnson.
Tony Hayes met Monique Johnson while he was moonlighting as a security guard at the apartment complex where she lived.
I'm Tony.
It's really nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, beautiful.
Monique would be what a lot of people considered very attractive. She described herself as light-skinned with long hair and having it going on.
Tony was really taken by her appearance.
For Monique, the attraction was mutual.
Dinner sometime?
Yeah, sure.
He was sort of this kind of charming guy, so they started dating, and I think she fell pretty hard for Tony. He would take her out to eat. They were spending every day together. He would send her flowers.
But as the couple ignited their romance, it didn't take Tony long to realize that Monique may be more than just a passing fling.
There's no doubt Monique and Tony had a lot in common.
Monique Johnson was a native of the region, had a hard upbringing, but managed to bring herself up by her own bootstraps. She was married and divorced, had 2 children.
Like Tony, Monique also shared a passion for law enforcement.
Monique worked as a deputy jailer for the Shelby County Sheriff's Department.
Having so much in common only heightened the couple's attraction to one another. But it was in the bedroom where the sparks really flew.
It became incredibly passionate, and it moved very quickly.
It was passionate, hot, and it seemed perfect. They were planning a future.
Though both Tony and Monique had tried and failed at marriage before, by the spring of 2006, the couple was talking engagement rings and wedding vows.
Tony was telling Monique, hey, one day we're going to get married and have this family.
They both believed that a part that had been missing in their lives had been completed.
In light of Tony's newfound happiness, his disappearance on September 4th, 2006 is even more concerning.
We want to know, why would he do this? Why he want to answer his phone, and why he want to call nobody and tell somebody where he at?
The following morning, Tony is absent from roll call at the Memphis Police's Union Station precinct, which makes his fellow officers extremely worried.
Has anybody seen Hayes?
By all accounts, Tony was a model officer, and when he failed to show up for a shift, alarm bells started to go off.
The police, to say the least, were taking Tony's disappearance very seriously.
But just what had happened to Officer Tony Hayes?
Try calling him again?
His colleagues and friends are determined to find out.
The Memphis Police Department was going to be very aggressive about it. We knew that it was going to be passionate for them as it was for us to seek what they thought was justice.
After a blissful year together, Deputy Jailer Monique Johnson and Police Officer Tony Hayes were already talking marriage.
Tony and Monique fell in love hard, and it was fast.
They appeared to be happy and a good match.
But now, on September 6th, 2006, Tony's been missing for more than 24 hours, and his colleagues at the Memphis Police Department are growing increasingly concerned.
The last time that his family had seen or spoken to Tony was on the afternoon of September the 3rd. He was supposed to come to a family picnic the next day, but he failed to show up.
Tony goes missing, and it does become a big deal quickly. Because of Tony's occupation, both as a police officer and the fact that he worked as security at the apartment complex, gave him exposure to a lot of volatile situations.
While Tony was missing, there were several scenarios discussed within the police department amongst his friends and family. Did someone put out a hit on Tony? Was it the result of some sort of investigation in which he was involved?
They were looking. The police were actively looking everywhere they could.
While detectives comb through Tony's arrest records in search of a lead, a team of officers execute a search of his home.
There's no evidence of foul play, but a search of his residence revealed his Lexus is missing from the garage.
Car's gone.
Police were looking for those plates in that car.
By that afternoon, Tony's disappearance is the talk of the town.
Missing persons reports typically get some media coverage depending on who is missing. But when a Memphis police officer, a person in charge of protecting the community, is now missing, it certainly got our attention and was quickly on the TV news, radio news, even in the newspaper.
Though Tony Hayes' loved ones are grateful for the attention, their fears continue to mount.
I tried to be optimistic, but after a day had went by and he hadn't called his mom, he hadn't checked in on his son, it became very evident that something was wrong.
No one seems more concerned about Tony's disappearance than his beloved girlfriend, Monique Johnson.
She was expressing her worry over Tony because she had called him several times and kept getting his machine. And so she said it was very unusual because if he wouldn't call back, he would text back.
But Monique's other pressing concern is the well-being of Tony's 11-year-old son, Devin.
She decided she'd check on the son. And so she got a French fries and the hamburger and took that over.
How are you doing, kiddo?
I just wish I knew where my dad was.
Me too.
Later that evening, investigators get their first chance to speak to Monique Johnson at her home in a brand new suburban development.
When was the last time that you actually saw Tony?
Well, that would have had to have been the morning of Monday, September 4th.
She said that they went to the casinos and they stayed down there that night and that they came back and that he was going to pick up the son.
Was that the last time you heard from him?
Yes, and I went to the movies that night. When I got out, I heard that Tony had been missing.
Have you ever had any kind of problems in your relationship with Tony?
No, not at all. I love him so much. And I really just hope that you guys find him.
As a deputy jailer in Shelby County, Monique knew the dangers of law enforcement. She was extremely worried about Tony's whereabouts, and she was hoping that everything would turn out okay.
They checked her story out, and she had gone out to see a movie the night of Tony's disappearance.
But before detectives leave that evening, they ask Monique one last question.
One angle we're still pursuing is that his disappearance was work-related. So had he mentioned anything to you about work lately? Any issues?
Actually, there is.
Look, I ain't got time to be standing out here all night. Come on, open the door, stop playing.
She remembers something happening at the apartments where he had to pull a gun on a guy and the guy threatened him.
Yo, I need you to calm down now. Leave the premises now, sir. I'll see you later, partner. I'll be back.
This was the apartment complex where Tony moonlighted. So there was some fear that something could have happened there.
He was essentially off duty and alone and far more susceptible.
While detectives dispatch a team to investigate Monique's allegations, they return to their station for a scheduled meeting with some of Tony's closest colleagues.
They thought Tony's co-workers might know something about problems with former perps.
But what Tony's co-workers are about to reveal will stun detectives, leaving them to wonder if this top cop had actually been living a double life.
This isn't the kind of thing you'd expect to turn up, and detectives realized it was going to be a game changer.
Police officer Tony Hayes seemed to have it all. A great career, a beautiful son, and a stunning girlfriend who set his heart aflame. But now Tony has disappeared without a trace, and detectives fear that he may have been targeted by a violent criminal with an axe to grind.
Police put themselves out there every day. Just going to work, it's possible they could be shot just for wearing a uniform.
Monique told police that Tony had recently been threatened by a guy at the apartment complex where Tony moonlighted.
But while searching for the mystery man who threatened Tony, detectives are also questioning Tony's colleagues at the Memphis Police Department.
The priority is to find Tony.
Yes.
And so I'm just here to ask you if you have anything you can share with us.
Anything could have happened to him, but his personal life is pretty complicated too.
What do you mean exactly?
That's when Tony's colleagues informed detectives that technically, Tony never officially divorced his ex-wife, Kayla Hayes.
During the investigation, Memphis PD discovers that Tony Hayes is married.
Tony's colleagues don't know, however, if Tony's wife knew about Monique or if Monique knew about Tony's wife.
At this point, detectives can't help but wonder, could Tony have been murdered by his own wife?
Thank you very much.
To answer that question, they decide to speak to Tony's wife, Kayla Hayes.
They learn that she is actually living and working in Las Vegas.
After contacting their counterparts at the Vegas PD, a local detective heads to Kayla's home.
Miss Hayes? I'm with the Las Vegas Police Department. Do you mind if I come in and speak with you for a moment?
Is this about Tony?
Yes, it is.
Kayla explains that a couple of days earlier, she had received word from Tony's family that he had gone missing.
When was the last time you spoke with Tony?
Honestly, it had been a while.
Kayla explains that they had been separated for about 1 year and 4 months. In fact, they had only been married for about 3 months before that.
We lived together in Memphis, but it was clear really early on that it just wasn't going to work out.
She said they wanted different things out of life, but apparently, Tony had a wandering eye.
His one vice was probably that he liked women a little too well. He was what could be called a player.
Were you aware he was seeing a woman named Monique Johnson?
Oh yeah, unfortunately, we had spoken.
His wife was calling to talk to Tony. And since Monique had Tony's phone, she answered. And the wife's going, "Who are you?" And Monique's going, "Who are you?" She goes, "Well, I'm his wife." Well, that didn't sit well with Monique.
And how did you feel that he was seeing another woman?
Look, I have my life and he has his.
Kayla was adamant that she had nothing to do with Tony's disappearance and that she was in Las Vegas September 4th. And when they checked the car and flight records, her story checked out.
While Tony's wife Kayla seems innocent of any wrongdoing, her statement prompts detectives in Memphis to pay another visit to Tony's girlfriend, Monique Johnson.
They go back to Monique and they confront her about what they know at this point.
Monique doesn't deny any of it. She admits that she was furious when she found out that Tony was married.
When were you going to tell me?
Babe, listen to me.
No. When were you going to tell me? When were you going to tell me that you were married?
I'm sorry, I just didn't know how to tell you. It was over months before we met each other. Monique, it's just me and you.
According to Monique, Tony reassured her that she had nothing to worry about. Eventually, they reconciled, and since then, they hadn't had any other problems.
Detectives aren't sure what to make of Monique's story, but with no sign of Tony and no evidence of foul play, there's little else they can do.
They had a feeling Monique wasn't telling the whole story, but a feeling isn't grounds for an arrest.
While Monique remains adamant she has no idea what happened to Tony, investigators wonder if Tony's phone records might shed more light on his disappearance.
They pulled Tony's phone records and see he had gotten a text from a woman at 7 a.m. But this woman wasn't Monique Johnson.
Her name was Kim Chapman. So of course, the next question from police is, who is this woman? What's her connection to Tony Hayes?
That afternoon, detectives ask Kim Chapman to come to the station for an interview. When Kim arrives, she makes quite the impression.
She was very different from Monique. She was a professional woman. She was about 6 feet tall. She had a large frame.
Detectives want to know what her connection is to Tony Hayes. And she says they've been casually dating for the past few months.
The reason we called you in is because we've obtained phone records indicating you had contact with Tony on the date of his disappearance.
Yeah, I texted him because I wanted to go jogging. I was seeing if he was able to come with me.
According to Kim, she got a call back from Tony's phone a short time later. But the voice on the other end of the line wasn't what she expected.
What Kim reveals next will dramatically alter the course of the investigation into Tony Hayes' disappearance and illuminate just how sordid and potentially deadly his love life had become.
I think he was a fun-loving guy, a good guy, but someone who played the field too much. He just played with the wrong one.
For more than 48 hours, police in Memphis, Tennessee have been desperately trying to track down their missing colleague, Tony Hayes. The search for Tony has led investigators to a trio of beautiful young women, including Tony's wife, Kayla, his girlfriend, Monique Johnson, and the young woman now seated across from them at the station, Kim Chapman.
Kim Chapman admitted she and Tony were seeing each other and that she had texted him to go jogging the day he went missing. Investigators want to know if she had anything to do with his disappearance.
The last contact that you had with Tony was that text?
Well, I got a call back from someone else. I don't know who she is. Her name was Monique.
Hello?
Kim says she answered the phone expecting it to be Tony, but instead, somebody else was on the line. Monique Johnson.
Monique says, "What are you doing getting together with Tony?" And Kim's going, "Whoa, who are you and why do you care?"
And Monique said, "Well, who are you? I'm Tony's girlfriend. Well, he's been with me all weekend. Did you know about me?"
I don't care. No.
Kim claims the call dropped moments later, but not before she heard another voice in the background.
Tony.
Kim says she heard Tony's voice, and he was angry. And Monique was just giving it right back to him.
Monique Johnson had previously told police she had no reason to harm Tony. But if Kim Chapman's statement is true, detectives have proof that Monique and Tony got in a heated argument just hours before he disappeared.
The detectives don't think this is a coincidence.
That evening, investigators bring Monique in for questioning a third time and confront her about Kim's allegations.
I'm going to give you one last chance to be honest with us and tell us what really happened to Tony Hayes.
I don't know.
Ms. Johnson, we talked to Kim Chapman. She told us that the day that Tony disappeared, you and him got into a scuffle.
Monique knows she's in a really bad place. So she says, okay, I'll talk.
Monique says that after she confronted Tony about his marriage to Kayla Hayes, he assured her there were no other women in his life. But over time, Monique began to doubt that he was truly faithful to her.
There were some flags. It would be unexplained absences or a refusal to really acknowledge where he'd been or what he'd been doing, or phone calls that he couldn't take. That's when tempers began to flare on both sides. He became very adamant about it not happening, or angry that she didn't trust him, and she was very angry that he wasn't trustworthy.
Monique claims that the situation came to a head the morning Tony disappeared.
The phone is going off, and she is compelled by the mistrust to look at the phone. And it is a text.
Monique says the text was from one Kim Chapman.
Monique said in her statement that she was tired of being played around with.
She couldn't take it no more. She was just real jealous.
She grabbed the phone and left Tony's house while he was in the shower and jumped in her car and began to call the female.
According to Monique, she was driving to her house while on the phone with Kim. And by the time she pulled into her garage, she was boiling mad.
Who the hell is this? While Monique is having this conversation with Ken, she spots Tony in her rearview mirror. He's caught up to her and wants his phone back.
Give me the damn phone. Give me the damn phone. I'm not playing with you, I'm serious. Give me the damn phone.
According to Monique, that's when Tony lunged at her.
She doesn't think he's coming for the phone. She thinks he's coming for her.
She described it, Tony hit her this time.
Get out the car.
Monique claims Tony's aggressive behavior was so terrifying that she feared for her life. That's when she reached for Tony's .40 caliber handgun, which he'd recently left under the passenger seat of her car.
And that's when it happens. She remembers the first shot, and that's about all she remembers.
That was so scary.
She asserts she acted in self-defense.
But if Monique had truly acted in self-defense, why is this the first time detectives are hearing this story?
From her perspective, because Tony was a police officer, she was afraid to go and confess to the same people that he worked with.
Monique says that in a panic, she turned to the only person she could think of, her son from a previous marriage, 16-year-old Donald Wallace.
Monique enlists the help of her son to remove Tony's body from the home, stuff him in the trunk of his own Lexus.
She made the son an accomplice to that act. I mean, what a horrible thing to do to your 16-year-old.
Detectives push Monique to tell them where Tony's body is. Monique does them one better. She takes them to the East Memphis apartment complex where she and her son Donald abandoned the vehicle.
They placed her in the squad car, and she took them directly to Tony's Lexus. And the body was in the trunk of that vehicle.
They backed it in so no one would notice the license plates.
That body had been sitting there for 4 days in this Memphis heat, and it was highly deformed. It was very hard to look at the body and even tell that it was Tony.
While CSIs process the car, detectives break the tragic news to Tony's family.
The police department came over there and told her that Monique Johnson has confessed to what happened.
Mother Hay was devastated. So many hopes and dreams are lost when your child is gone and you know he's not going to come back. And it's especially when it's due to violence. It just hurts more.
With Monique's confession, this deputy jailer now finds herself behind bars. Though she doesn't expect to be there for long.
She remained adamant that this was purely a case of self-defense and that she was the victim, not Tony.
But soon, an unlikely witness will step forward with new information. Information that threatens to turn the whole case upside down.
It's so inexcusable. It's not just the public doesn't understand, nobody understands.
On Friday, September 8th, 2006, in a Memphis police station, Monique Johnson confessed to shooting her boyfriend, police officer Tony Hayes, in a heated argument inside the garage of her home. A shooting Monique insists she only committed in self-defense.
She claims he lunged at her, struck her, attacked her, and she defended herself.
To find out if there's any truth to Monique's story, investigators bring in the young man who helped Monique move Tony's body, her 16-year-old son, Donald.
Your mother told us that you helped her carry Tony's body.
Donald, because of that, at this point, we're going to be charging you with accessory after the fact, okay? However, if you're willing to cooperate with us, there's a chance that we can get you off or help at least cut you a deal.
Okay.
Donald starts by telling detectives where to find the gun used in the shooting. It's in a garbage dumpster at an East Memphis apartment complex.
It was Tony's personal weapon, a .40 caliber pistol.
But that isn't all Donald tells police. He also makes a chilling revelation about the hours following Tony's death.
There was a time period after the shooting where Monique and her son left. They went to TGI Fridays, and then they went to a movie with some family members and saw snakes on a plane.
She went to dinner and a movie and enjoyed herself while her supposed boyfriend is starting to rot.
Was this the behavior simply of a woman in shock? Or was Monique actively trying to establish an alibi for herself in order to throw police off her trail? What Donald says next gives investigators a possible clue. In fact, he claims he was in the house at the time of the shooting.
Mom? He hears a series of gunshots go off in his own house, and he is instinctively terrified of what has happened to his mother.
Mom, what's going on? What did you do to him? He eventually gets into the bedroom and discovers his mother, frantic by that point, and Tony lying on the floor bleeding.
The significance of that statement is that it directly contradicts Monique's version of events. She claims the shooting took place in the garage.
Police execute a search warrant of Monique's home, but at first there seems to be a problem with young Donald's story.
There was no blood up in that bathroom or bedroom, no bullets.
But as investigators take a closer look at the scene, they spot something unusual about the doors leading to the bathroom.
The paint didn't actually match up with the same paint that Monique had on her house. So you could tell that there had been one of the doors replaced in her home.
Detectives confront Monique about the new doors in her house, as well as the discrepancy between Donald's statement and her own version of what happened. Once again, Monique changes her story. She now claims that her fight began in the garage, but ended inside the house.
That whirlwind proceeds into the house. Tony's following her.
Monique says she fled to the safety of her master bedroom, but Tony forced his way inside.
He slams the door, locks it, and she feels a fist hit her in the back of the head.
Monique claims that before she knew what was happening, Tony was physically assaulting her. Thankfully, she managed to escape into the bathroom, but Tony didn't stop coming for her.
She's really getting scared, and she's telling him, Tony, just leave me alone, Tony, go. He's coming into the bathroom towards her. Finally, she finds her way back to her master closet, just behind the bathroom, and that's where her gun is.
She felt like she had nowhere to hide, nowhere to go, and nothing to do other than to defend herself.
After the first shot, she describes herself as going into a state of shock. She's unable to really accurately describe the physicality of what happened, the number of bullets that come out of the gun.
In the aftermath that followed, Monique says she noticed a bullet hole in one of the bathroom doors.
Monique went to one of the empty homes or model homes in the neighborhood and took one of the doors out of another model home and brought it and put it back on her bathroom door.
All the while, Monique's son was helping her do this.
Just grab his feet and help me.
But Monique insists that she only concocted her first story to try to minimize her son's role in the shooting.
She doesn't want Donald involved. She doesn't want him to go to jail. She wanted him out of it.
She was a mother trying to protect her son.
For Memphis authorities, Monique's shifting story casts serious doubt on her claims of self-defense.
Her story keeps changing. First, the argument and the shooting take place in the garage. Then, it had happened upstairs in her bedroom.
Later that day, the coroner's office releases Tony's autopsy report, and it casts even more doubt over Monique's statement.
He was shot 6 times. 4 bullets entered through his back, 1 through his chest, and 1 through his head at a downward angle. This woman, who's 5'6", was supposedly cowering from a 6'1" man.
4 shots in the back, 1 in the head, a downward projectile. So what does that look like? It looks like she's standing over him, executing him, and 1 in the chest.
There was no doubt in the state's mind that this was a premeditated murder.
Since the statement from Monique's son Donald helped investigators get closer to the truth, they grant him some leeway on the accessory charges.
Donald was placed on judicial diversion for his role, and he was really given a great opportunity to move forward with his life.
But prosecutors plan to pursue Monique with the full force of the law. On February 9th, 2007, Monique Johnson is indicted on first-degree murder charges.
If she was convicted, she could spend the rest of her life in prison.
But was this truly the slam-dunk case that prosecutors believed? Or was Monique Johnson and her defense team saving the best version of her ever-changing story for last?
Everyone, again, they rushed to judgment. And all we could say was, you just wait until you hear the full story before you make your judgment on Monique Johnson.
In Memphis, Monique Johnson insists she acted in self-defense when she shot and killed her boyfriend, police officer Tony Hayes. But prosecutors believe Monique murdered Tony in cold blood.
The crux of this case essentially revolves around whether or not Monique Johnson was the victim, the perpetrator, or both of intimate partner violence.
Before the case even makes it to trial, sparring begins between the prosecution and defense. At a pretrial hearing, Monique's legal team tries to keep crime scene photos out of court.
The pictures that were taken of the car and the trunk when they opened it and found Tony Hayes there were particularly graphic, and it was the state's contention that it was essential that the jury see these pictures, because this is in fact what she did to him. This is what Monique did to Tony.
But according to the defense, these photos had nothing to do with how Tony was murdered and were just the byproduct of decomposition in the sweltering Memphis heat.
We were able to keep some of those pictures out because they were pretty nasty and pretty ugly.
The judge did not let any pictures of his body to go to the jury. I knew that was going to hurt us with the jury because pictures speak 1,000 words and jurors want to see them.
On February 12, 2008, Monique Johnson's murder trial gets underway inside a packed Shelby County courtroom.
It's a case that's captured the public's fascination, probably because it does involve an attractive couple, one of whom's a police officer and the other's a correctional officer. You'd expect them to behave better.
In their opening statements, prosecutors portray Monique as a scorned, jealous lover who was out for revenge against her two-timing boyfriend.
Tony did have a reputation for playing around with women, and I don't think she wanted to be played with. She was angry.
So angry, in fact, that when Monique discovered Kim Chapman's text message on September 4th, 2006, the beautiful femme fatale concocted a plan to exact the ultimate revenge against her unfaithful boyfriend.
The state feels like Monique's state of mind was. She was, in essence, creating a trap. Monique wanted to trap him back in her bedroom.
Tony was shot 6 times, including a round that was fired in a downward trajectory. As far as the state was concerned, that seriously undermined Monique's story of self-defense.
Then there's Monique's evasive actions in the aftermath of the shooting. She lied to police, she hid his body and the weapon used to kill him, and cleaned up the scene.
But Monique's defense team asserts their client did have a legitimate reason to be scared of Tony Hayes that morning.
The defense team essentially stated that she was a battered woman and was acting in self-defense.
She said maybe 3 months into the relationship was the first episode of abuse. A few months later, there's this next episode. and eventually it was more frequent.
To bolster their claims of abuse, the defense calls several members of Monique's family to the witness stand.
They testified that they had seen marks on her neck and on her thighs.
But for prosecutors, as well as Tony's friends and family, the abuse allegations don't hold much water.
The reason Monique said that she pulled the trigger, that my uncle was abusive, but no police report on domestic violence or nothing like that ever happened.
I knew Tony for 32 years. I never knew him to ever hit a lady. I think Monique was just trying to come up with a defense.
In fact, prosecutors say if anyone in the relationship had a history of violence, it was Monique. As proof, they point to a report Tony filed against her in May of 2006.
In a fit of jealous rage, Monique cut Tony's clothes, carved obscenities into his headboard and into the side of his car, cut the electrical cords on his appliances, and poured baby oil into his shoes.
Tony did call police, though he didn't go forward with charges.
So it was clear in the state's mind that he was the victim. He was the one who was being psychologically abused.
So was Monique Johnson a violent and vindictive lover like prosecutors claim? Or is she, as the defense suggests, a victim of abuse? On Valentine's Day 2008, jurors got to hear Monique's side of the story firsthand.
I was very concerned that Monique probably should not take the stand. But in trying to establish self-defense, the jury would need to hear from Monique. They would need to understand her mental state.
She would start crying when presented with certain things, like her prior vandalism. She would go, well, you know, he just did so much to make me so angry, and I felt like I could never be free of him. And it was all her being oppressed.
I would ask her, did you love Tony? And she would start bawling and say, yeah, I loved him. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want him to die. It became pretty clear that she wasn't just this cold, calculating killer, but was truly someone who was in love with Tony and didn't know how to get away from it.
But who would the jury find more credible? Monique and her emotional testimony, or the state and its physical and circumstantial evidence? On February 15th, they hand down their verdict.
She wasn't found guilty of first-degree murder, but a lesser charge of reckless homicide, which carries a 2 to 4 year sentence.
For prosecutors and Tony's family, it's a crushing defeat.
It was just like someone had knocked all the air out of me. Really? Did we hear this right? This can't be true.
The real victim of domestic violence in this situation was Tony Hayes. He lost his life. He was shot 6 times, and she got away with murder.
For Monique Johnson, the verdict is better than anything she could have imagined.
That was a huge win for us. Huge. Probably one of the best verdicts I've received in my lifetime as a trialist.
The heavy scent of ozone hangs in the air, a precursor to the storm of truth that is about to tear through the facade of a 19-year-old mystery. We are standing on the precipice of a revelation, looking back into the hollowed-out silence of a 2005 night that refused to offer up its secrets for nearly 2 decades. It was a cold case that became a phantom, a whisper in the ears of a community that learned to live with the specter of an unresolved violence. But tonight, the static is clearing. We aren't just revisiting a crime. We are witnessing the terrifying collision of a buried past with the unsparing light of the present. Imagine the scene: a quiet, unassuming suburban home, the kind where the mail is always delivered on time and the lawn is a testament to neighborly pride, suddenly becoming the epicenter of a nightmare. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day that usually bleeds into the next without a ripple until the thin, piercing wail of a telephone shattered the calm. The call came from the study, a frantic, breathless plea for help that stopped mid-sentence. leaving the operator with nothing but the suffocating hum of a line that had gone dead. When the first patrol units arrived, their tires crunching against the gravel in the driveway, they found the front door standing wide open, swinging rhythmically in the midnight wind like a beckoning finger. Inside, the silence was aggressive, a physical weight that pressed against the chest of every officer who stepped across the threshold. The victim, a man whose life was built on the bedrock of meticulous routines and predictable patterns, was found slumped over his desk, his life's work scattered like confetti around him. There was no sign of a struggle, no shattered glass, no chaotic disarray that usually marks the site of a violent end. Instead, there was a clinical, disturbing order. A half-finished glass of whiskey sat on the coaster, the ice long since melted, and a single page of a manuscript remained face up, the ink still fresh as if he had been pulled from his thoughts by a ghost. The detectives moved like shadows, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, documenting a crime scene that defied every instinct they possessed. It felt intimate, almost choreographed, the work of someone who knew the rhythm of this house, someone who had waited in the dark corners until the moment of perfection. The investigation, initially fueled by a frantic, high-octane desperation, quickly began to lose its momentum, stalling against the immovable wall of a lack of physical evidence. There were no fingerprints on the desk, no DNA profile in the system that matched the stray fibers found on the rug, and the neighbors, all of whom were asleep in their own fortress-like homes, reported nothing more than the distant bark of a dog at 2 a.m. It was a classic cold case in the making, the kind that detectives dread, where every lead is a dead end and every witness is a question mark. The community, once united in their shock, began to fracture under the weight of the unanswered questions. Speculation grew like weeds, twisting the narrative of a simple, hard-working man into something dark and convoluted. Was it a professional hit, executed with surgical precision? Or was it a crime of passion, the result of a secret life that the victim had kept hidden beneath his professional exterior? These questions became the soundtrack of the town, a low-frequency hum of paranoia that persisted for weeks, then months, then years. Every passing anniversary of the tragedy served as a brutal reminder of the failure of justice, a yearly reopening of a wound that refused to scab over. The file, thick with failed interviews and dusty photographs, was relegated to the back of the archives, but for the investigators who had worked the scene, it was a persistent, gnawing failure. They would look at the photos of the study, the way the light hit the desk, the stillness of the room, and they would feel the phantom pull of a truth that was just out of reach. They knew, with a certainty that burned in their guts, that the killer hadn't just walked away. He had folded himself back into the life of the town, wearing a mask of normalcy that was so perfect it had become invisible. Years bled into a decade, and the decades stretched toward 20, the case becoming less of a crime and more of a local myth. Children who had been born after the event grew up hearing the story in hushed tones, the victim's name becoming synonymous with the fragility of their own suburban safety. The house was sold, repainted, and inhabited by a new family who knew nothing of the history that lived in the walls, but the investigators stayed in the hunt. They waited for the technology to catch up to their intuition. They waited for the moment when a stray strand of hair, a microscopic trace of something left behind on a coaster, would finally be able to tell its story. And then it happened, not with a bang, but with a digital handshake across a database that had been growing for years, a breakthrough that sent shockwaves through the department. It wasn't just a match, it was a revelation that turned the entire motive of the crime on its head. The suspect, a man who had seemingly lived a life of unremarkable virtue, had been hiding in plain sight, his connection to the victim far more complex and personal than anyone had ever dared to dream. The motive wasn't greed, and it wasn't a random act of violence. It was a long-simmering, deeply personal grudge that had been cultivated in the dark, a slow-burning fuse that had finally reached the dynamite on that fateful night. When the SWAT team descended on his residence, the quiet of the cul-de-sac was shattered, the neighbors watching in horrified disbelief as the man they had trusted, the man who had coached the local soccer team and donated to the neighborhood fund, was let out in handcuffs. The arrest was the catalyst, the spark that ignited a firestorm of long-buried truths that were about to come to the surface. As the suspect was processed, the interrogation room became the crucible where 19 years of lies were finally burned away. He sat, a shell of a man, his composure cracking not under the pressure of the detective's questions, but under the sheer weight of his own secrets. He began to speak, his voice a low, raspy whisper that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement, detailing the months of planning, the observation of the victim's habits, the slow unraveling of his own sanity that led him to that front door. He spoke of the motive with a chilling, detached clarity, explaining how the victim had been the architect of his own misfortune, a man who had made a single, catastrophic mistake years prior that had ruined the suspect's life. The story was a tapestry of obsession and revenge, a narrative that had been playing on a loop in the suspect's mind for nearly 2 decades. The detectives listened, their pens scratching against the paper, their hearts heavy with the realization that they had been looking for a monster, but had instead found a man who had been poisoned by his own resentment. The motive, so shocking in its simplicity, turned the community's perspective upside down. It wasn't a mystery of who anymore, it was a haunting exploration of why. The community, having spent years fearing a random killer, now had to reckon with the fact that the threat had been something far more intimate, far more human, and far more terrifying. The trial, when it finally commenced, was a theater of raw emotion and clinical forensic evidence, the two worlds colliding in a way that left no one in the gallery unmoved. The prosecution laid out the evidence with surgical precision, showing how the suspect's life had been a carefully constructed facade, a series of calculated choices designed to keep him in the shadows. They brought forth witnesses who had seen him near the house, who had noted the subtle shifts in his behavior, the way he would linger, watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Every piece of evidence, the fiber match, the digital footprint, the recovered diary pages, was like a piece of a clockwork mechanism being assembled in real time, building to a crescendo that the suspect was powerless to stop. The defense, meanwhile, was a study in desperation, trying to frame the crime as an impulsive act of madness, but the evidence was too overwhelming, the narrative too coherent. The motive, that shocking, revealed core of the case, became the anvil upon which the jury hammered out their verdict. The gallery was a sea of familiar faces, the people who had lived in the shadow of this crime for so long, their eyes wide with the realization that the man they had known was nothing more than a carefully crafted performance. There was a palpable shift in the air when the verdict was read, a release of tension that felt like a physical weight being lifted from the entire town. It wasn't a celebratory release, it was a solemn, heavy relief, the kind that comes when a long, agonizing mystery is finally put to rest. The suspect, when he heard the words, didn't react with anger or surprise. He simply closed his eyes, a look of profound, exhausted resignation washing over his face. He had finally been brought to the end of his path, and the truth had proven to be the only thing that could set him and the community free. The long, dormant cold case was solved, but the ripple effects of the revelation were just beginning to reach the shores of the town's collective consciousness. The aftermath of the trial was a period of intense, often painful reflection. The community had to come to terms with the fact that their neighbor was capable of such a cold, calculated act, and that they had failed to see the warning signs until it was far too late. They spent hours sitting on their porches, talking in low tones, trying to reconcile the memory of the man they had known with the reality of the predator they had helped to sustain. The house, which had been the silent witness to the crime, became a focal point of their attention, a place of pilgrimage where they would stand and think about the life that had been lost and the life that had been discarded. The victim's family, who had lived with the absence for so long, found themselves in a new, strange landscape, one where the questions were answered, but the grief was still as sharp as ever. They were no longer victims of an unknown killer. They were the survivors of a long, dark journey, and the truth, while necessary, was not a magic cure for their pain. I find myself thinking about the detectives, the men who had kept the flame of the investigation burning when all the world had turned away. They weren't heroes in a traditional sense. They were the custodians of a memory, the ones who had held onto the file until it finally had the chance to speak. They had done the heavy lifting of justice, the quiet, repetitive, and often unrewarding work of persistence. In the final days after the trial, they could be seen walking through the archives, cleaning up the last of the paperwork, their faces etched with the quiet satisfaction of a job finished. They weren't looking for a medal. They were looking for the peace that comes from knowing that the truth is no longer a secret. The case was a milestone, a reminder that the law, despite its flaws, is a powerful tool in the hands of those who refuse to give up. The town is slowly beginning to move on, the rhythms of suburban life reasserting themselves with a force that feels almost unnatural after the intensity of the trial. The children are playing in the streets, the lawns are being manicured, and the people are beginning to trust one another again, though the trust is now guarded, seasoned by the knowledge of what happened behind the closed doors of 2005. The story of the cold case has become a piece of history, a narrative that will be retold for years to come, a cautionary tale that will serve as a permanent reminder of the shadow that can hide in the light. It is a story of justice, yes, but it is also a story of the cost of that justice, the cost to the family, to the community, and to the detectives who lived with the mystery in their pockets for so long. The final chapter is being written in the quiet moments of the present, in the way the town is learning to redefine its relationship with its own history. The truth is no longer a ghost. It is a part of their identity, a foundation upon which they are learning to rebuild. The 2005 murder is no longer a cold case, but a lesson that has been etched into the bedrock of their community. We have seen how the truth can claw its way out of the dark, and we have seen how justice, for all its agonizing delays, can eventually find its way home. The story is a testament to the fact that even the most deeply buried secrets are subject to the relentless passage of time, and that the truth, no matter how long it stays in the dark, is an inevitable force of nature. We stand now looking back at the long, winding road that brought us to this moment, and we realize that the journey was just as important as the destination. We have explored the depths of the mystery, we have faced the darkness of the suspect's mind, and we have witnessed the resilience of a community that refused to be destroyed by the secrets it kept. The light that is now shining on the 2005 cold case is not the harsh, blinding glare of a spotlight. It is the warm, steady light of understanding. We know the story, we know the motive, and we know the end, but the memory of the mystery remains, a permanent feature of the town's landscape. The long, dormant cold case is closed, the final page is turned, and we are left with the silence that follows a great and terrible truth, a silence that is no longer empty, but filled with the peace of knowing and the strength of having finally walked through the fire. The courtroom, once an arena of speculation, had transformed into a vessel of excruciating precision as the second phase of the trial began, unearthing layers of a life that had been meticulously sanded down to appear seamless. The defendant, a man who for 19 years had occupied a space in the suburban landscape as a fixture of quiet utility, sat immobile, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had turned the color of bone. He was no longer the man who attended the block parties or offered to look after his neighbors' pets while they were away. He was an object of forensic scrutiny, a specimen pulled from the amber of a life he had curated to shield himself from the very reality he was now forced to confront. The atmosphere was dense, heavy with the collective realization that the man on the stand was not just a defendant, but a vessel for a history that had been carefully, almost surgically, redacted. The lead detective, watching from the gallery, remembered the exact moment the realization had hit him, the moment the familial DNA search had provided the final, fatal connection. It was like seeing a thread pulled from a tapestry that held the entire image together, and once the thread was loose, the entire life of the suspect began to unravel. The narrative of the 2005 night began to change, shifting from a tale of a random, inexplicable intrusion into a story of calculated, cold-blooded intent. The prosecution, methodical and ruthless in their pursuit of the timeline, began to fill in the gaps that had kept the case cold for nearly 2 decades. They presented the phone records, long forgotten in the deep storage archives, and highlighted the peculiar frequency of calls to a burner phone that had vanished into the ether immediately following the crime. The suspect had not been a stranger. He had been a ghost in the victim's machine, a silent observer whose presence had been hiding in the background of 1,000 mundane conversations. It was this revelation that hit the community like a physical blow, the idea that the proximity of the threat had been intimate, a betrayal of the very concept of neighborhood. People who had lived in the same cul-de-sac, who had shared coffee and conversation, were now forced to reevaluate every interaction, every moment of perceived kindness, and every sign they had willfully ignored. The courtroom became a mirror where the town saw its own gullibility reflected back, a harsh, unforgiving light cast on the fragility of their suburban peace. As the forensic pathologist took the stand, the room seemed to shrink, the silence becoming absolute as the details of the victim's final moments were laid out with clinical detachment. The cause of death had not been a sudden explosion of violence, but a systematic, deliberate act, the kind of act that requires not just hate, but a commitment to the process of destruction. The victim had been targeted because of an ancient, festering grievance, a debt that the suspect felt had never been settled, a grudge that had been nurtured in the soil of his own insecurity until it had bloomed into a mandate for murder. The jurors listened, their faces rigid, their pens moving across their notebooks in a rhythmic, desperate attempt to capture the magnitude of the malice that had been hidden for so long. The prosecutor, her voice low and resonant, began to weave the evidence into a motive that defied common sense, but resonated with a chilling, internal logic. It wasn't about the victim's professional success, which was the theory they had chased for years. It was about a personal slight, a moment of humiliation that the suspect had held onto with a fanatical intensity, a grudge that had become the anchor of his existence. The testimony of a surprise witness, a woman who had worked with the suspect at a long-defunct office in the early 2000s, shattered the final defense of the suspect's normalcy. She spoke of his temper, of the way his eyes would go dead when he was challenged, and of a specific conversation where he had explicitly described the victim as the architect of his ruined potential. The courtroom seemed to gasp in unison. This was the missing key, the motive that had remained locked away in the memories of someone who hadn't realized the importance of what she had heard until she saw the suspect's face on the news, 19 years later. The suspect, for the first time, looked toward the gallery, his eyes meeting the gaze of the witness, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the mask slipped. The mask of the helpful neighbor, the unassuming worker, the reliable friend. It fell away to reveal the raw, unadulterated coldness of a man who had been defined by a single, catastrophic desire for retribution. It was a moment of profound, unsettling clarity that hung in the air long after the witness had stepped down. Throughout the afternoon, the prosecution continued to build the scaffold of their case, presenting the digital trail of the suspect's search history, his hidden accounts, and the chillingly mundane notes he had kept on the victim's routine. It was a diary of a hunt, a chronicle of a predator who had found a way to blend into the very fabric of the life he was intent on ending. The jury was presented with the reality of his double life, existence where he would play the role of the devoted family man during the day and, in the quiet hours, obsessively refine the details of his plan. The motive was not some high-stakes conspiracy. It was small, petty, and deeply personal, a reflection of a man who had decided that the only way to heal his own sense of inadequacy was to erase the person he blamed for it. This banality made the crime all the more terrifying, reinforcing the idea that the most dangerous threats are not the ones that arrive with the roar of a storm, but those that wait in the silence, growing in the dark. The defense, sensing the erosion of their client's standing, began their attempt to reframe the motive as a consequence of a mental decline that had been accelerated by the suspect's personal isolation. They brought in a psychiatrist who argued that the suspect had been living in a state of dissociative fantasy, that he had convinced himself that the victim was responsible for a life of misery that had in fact been of his own making. It was a sophisticated argument, one designed to elicit pity and shift the blame from the perpetrator's intent to his own psychological fragility. But the prosecution's rebuttal was a masterful display of evidence-based dismantling. They showed the jury the suspect's financial records, his meticulous planning, and the way he had scrubbed his digital life clean after the murder. Actions that were not the hallmarks of a man in the grip of a fugue state, but of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and wanted to ensure he would never be held to account. As the day's proceedings came to an end, the atmosphere in the building was heavy with the weight of the truths that had been unearthed. The 2005 case, once a mystery that had baffled the finest minds in the department, had become a transparent, undeniable record of a man who had chosen to be a killer. The jurors were dismissed, their faces masks of serious contemplation, the burden of their duty etched into their expressions. They had seen the truth, and now they had to live with the knowledge of what had been hidden in their midst for nearly 2 decades. The family of the victim, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom for hours, remained in their seats long after the bailiffs had signaled the end of the session, as if the reality of the motive was so complex, so painful, that they needed the quiet of the room to finally let it sink into their bones. The news outlets outside were already preparing their evening segments, the headlines shifting from "cold case solved" to "the motive that shocked the community." The story was no longer just about the arrest, it was about the failure of their collective perception. How had they missed him? How had he survived among them, a wolf in the most benign of sheep's clothing? The questions were beginning to circulate through the town, through the school boards, through the social clubs, and through the quiet, darkened living rooms where people sat wondering about their own neighbors. The trial was forcing a reckoning that went far beyond the legal conclusion of the 2005 case. It was a social autopsy, a deep-tissue examination of the ways in which people choose to look away, the ways in which they build their own illusions of safety, and the ways in which a secret can be sustained by the very people it is eventually going to destroy. The detective who had led the investigation back to the cold case unit walked out of the courthouse, the cold night air biting at his skin. He felt a profound, heavy sense of duty performed, but he also felt the cold sting of the reality they had uncovered. He had spent years imagining the suspect as a monster, a figure of mythic proportions, but the truth was something far more pedestrian and therefore more haunting. The motive was petty, the suspect was ordinary, and the tragedy was preventable. The realization that justice could be served, but that it could never restore the balance of the life that had been taken, settled over him like a frost. He started his car, the engine's idle steady, grounding vibration in the silence of the night, and looked one last time at the courthouse. The trial would continue tomorrow, the lawyers would resume their sparring, and the jury would reach their inevitable verdict, but the fundamental change had already occurred. The ghost of 2005 had been given a name, a motive, and a face, and the community would never be able to look at their own reflections in the same way again. As the hours of the night deepened, the town seemed to hold its breath. There was no sense of celebration, only the heavy, thoughtful silence of a community that was finally beginning to understand the price of its own ignorance. They had been living with a secret, and now that the secret was out, it felt like an exposed nerve. Every light that remained on in a window seemed to take on a new, more profound significance. The 2005 cold case was a finished chapter, but it was a chapter that would define the rest of their book, a permanent reference point for the way they saw themselves and each other. The trial was the crucible, and as the heat of the scrutiny continued to rise, they were being forged into something new, something that would be defined by the harsh, unyielding, and absolutely necessary light of the truth. The long, dormant mystery was awake, and as the morning approached, it was ready to be finally, definitively, laid to rest. The third phase of the trial descended upon the courtroom like a gathering storm, the air thick with a tension so palpable it seemed to stifle the very act of breathing. We had moved past the initial revelations of motive, past the initial shattering of the suburban facade, and now we were stepping into the visceral, jagged heart of the crime itself. The prosecution, relentless and precise, began to construct a minute-by-minute timeline of the night in 2005, a reconstruction so agonizingly detailed that it felt as though we were being transported back in time, forced to witness the slow erosion of a life in the dark of that study. The defendant remained a static figure, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table as if searching for a hidden exit, but his body language betrayed the storm raging beneath the surface, a subtle tremor in his hands, the way his jaw would clench at the mention of specific, damning details. The courtroom had become a stage for the final act of a long-dormant tragedy, and every person in the room, from the jury to the spectators in the back row, felt the gravity of the unfolding narrative. The witnesses called to the stand in this phase were not those who spoke of character or motive, but those who spoke of the physical realities of that night. A retired forensic investigator, his voice gravelly with age, described the state of the room, the placement of the victim's coffee cup, the specific angle at which the light from the window illuminated the desk. He walked the jury through the physics of the crime, the precision of the intruder's movements, and the haunting, calculated efficiency that had confounded the original team back in 2005. It was a masterclass in the cold, unyielding nature of evidence. The defense, clearly struggling to maintain their stance of psychological instability, looked increasingly beleaguered, their objections frequent and sharp, yet they were being dismantled by the sheer weight of the forensic story. The prosecutor, moving with the confidence of someone who had spent 19 years rehearsing this moment, led the expert through a series of questions that painted a portrait of a predator who had not only planned the crime, but had savored the execution. Each exhibit presented was like a new piece of a jagged, dark puzzle. The clothing recovered from the suspect's storage unit, the digital residue of the research he had conducted on the victim's schedule, all of it came together to create a landscape of obsession that was impossible to look away from. The family of the victim, seated in the front row, remained a monolith of controlled suffering, their faces masks of pale, frozen determination. They weren't there to watch a man be destroyed. They were there to see the truth be vindicated. Their eyes, though haunted, were fixed on the prosecutor as she mapped out the final, terrible minutes of the victim's life. It was a scene of communal witnessing, a process where the community was forced to confront the specific, ugly details of the violence they had been sheltered from for so long. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the occasional, stifled gasp or the rhythmic click-clack of the court reporter's keyboard, a sound that, in this context, felt like the ticking of a countdown clock toward an inevitable conclusion. The suspect's defense team attempted to weave a narrative of confusion, of the suspect being caught in a web of coincidences, but their arguments were becoming increasingly threadbare. They tried to suggest that the evidence had been tainted by the passage of time, that the memories of witnesses were unreliable, and that the prosecution was relying on a story that had been retrofitted to fit a suspect they had been desperate to find. But the evidence was not a memory. It was the cold, hard, chemical permanence of DNA and the electronic footprint of the suspect's own devices. When the prosecutor finally produced the recovered diary entries, fragments of thoughts the suspect had scribbled down in the months leading up to the murder, the courtroom seemed to recoil. These weren't just notes. They were the blueprints of a vendetta, written with a chilling, detached awareness of the act to come. It was the final nail in the coffin of the defense's strategy, a definitive proof that the murder was not an act of impulse, but the fruition of a long-term, carefully curated plan. As the afternoon sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the courtroom, the feeling of anticipation became electric. The suspect finally looked up, his gaze sweeping the room with a look of profound, hollow confusion, as if he were only now realizing that his own words had betrayed him. He hadn't expected the diary to exist. He had believed he had scrubbed his life clean of any trace of his obsession. The prosecutor, sensing the moment of his collapse, continued to press, asking him to account for specific passages, specific dates, specific desires. The defendant's refusal to answer, his retreat into a stubborn, terrified silence, was far more damning than any confession could have been. It was the silence of a man who had finally been trapped by his own hubris, a man who had lived in a world of his own making for 19 years, only to find it crumbling under the weight of an objective reality. The jury, a group of people who had been plucked from the quiet, ordinary life of the town, looked increasingly exhausted, their faces reflecting the psychological strain of what they had been tasked with digesting. They were the ones who had to take all of this, the forensic precision, the diary, the motive, the timeline, and synthesize it into a judgment. They weren't just weighing facts, they were weighing the very nature of human darkness. The judge, an anchor of stern, unwavering impartiality, kept the proceedings moving with a steady, watchful eye, ensuring that every legal safeguard was in place. The tension in the room was a living, breathing entity, shifting and evolving with every piece of evidence, every objection, and every lingering silence. It was a marathon of discovery, a process that was slow, methodical, and entirely necessary to clear the fog of the past. As the court adjourned for the evening, the exodus from the building was slow and hushed. People walked to their cars with their heads down, the weight of the day's testimony pressing upon them like the coming winter. The town, outside the hallowed walls of the courthouse, felt different. It felt like a place that was being hollowed out by the truth, stripped of its comfortable, ignorance-based peace and forced to deal with the reality of what had really happened. They weren't just discussing a crime anymore. They were discussing the nature of their neighbor, the nature of their town, and the nature of the monsters they had lived among without ever knowing it. The trial was the prism through which the entire community was being forced to view their own history, and it was a view that was both illuminating and terrifying. I stood by the entrance, watching the last of the reporters pack up their gear, the lights of their satellite trucks reflecting off the dark pavement. They were moving on, but the town would remain, and the impact of the trial would resonate through the generations. The 2005 case was no longer just a cold case. It was a watershed moment, a point of no return for everyone involved. I walked back toward the parking lot, the wind whipping through the trees, the sound of the town around me, the distant, muffled rush of traffic, the hum of the streetlights, feeling more like the background noise of a world that had been fundamentally altered. The trial had done its job. It had taken a mystery that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for 19 years and had forced it to be examined in the cold, clear, and uncompromising light of justice. The resolution was approaching, and as I thought about the diary entries, the timeline, and the suspect's final, desperate silence, I felt a sense of profound, heavy certainty. The truth would hold. The truth, finally, would be enough. The long night of 2005 was drawing to a close, and as the stars appeared above the horizon, they didn't look like distant, uncaring lights, but like witnesses to a long, hard-fought, and absolutely vital reckoning that was finally coming to an end. The town, in its quiet, dark, and thoughtful corners, was preparing for the final verdict, and as the world continued to turn, the sense of inevitability was as strong as the winter air. The ghost of 2005 was finally being forced to answer for its sins, and the path to justice, while paved with the fragments of a broken life, was finally, definitively, clear. The fourth act of this trial began with the atmosphere in the courtroom so thin, so electrically charged with the impending weight of finality, that it felt as if one single breath could shatter the glass of the observation deck. We were now dissecting the aftermath, not the aftermath of the murder, but the 19-year aftermath of the suspect's successful deception. The prosecution had shifted its focus from the night of the crime to the years of performance that followed. They were building a case not just of a killer, but of a master of masks, someone who had integrated into the community with such calculated, chilling normalcy that he had been the very person to help organize the memorial services for the man he had murdered. This was the level of psychological warfare the jury was now being forced to confront. The lead prosecutor brought forward evidence of the suspect's financial growth, his social climbing, and his participation in local government, all while he carried the dead man's secret like a dark, heavy stone in his pocket. It was a narrative of profound, almost sociopathic, duality. Every witness that stepped onto the stand during this phase offered a different, fractured piece of the suspect's identity. There was the former business partner who spoke of the suspect's uncanny ability to remain cool under pressure, even when the investigation into the 2005 murder was at its most intense. There was the neighbor who recalled how the suspect would spend hours, in the middle of the night, standing in his own backyard, looking over at the crime scene house with an expression that, in retrospect, was not concern, but possession. The jury's collective reaction was one of mounting, quiet horror. They were being asked to look at a man they had seen every day for years, a man who had been a fixture in their town, and see him as a predator who had essentially been living off the energy of the community's collective grief. The prosecutor's voice, a steady, rhythmic cadence of indictment, guided the jury through this psychological landscape, making it impossible for them to dismiss the suspect's behavior as anything other than the deliberate, predatory actions of a man who had no remorse. The defense, realizing that their client's image was being dismantled piece by piece, took a desperate, dangerous gamble. They put the suspect on the stand. It was a move that sent a wave of electric anticipation through the room, a collective leaning in of the gallery. For the first time in 19 years, the voice of the man who had been the phantom of the 2005 cold case was going to be heard in a public forum. He walked to the stand with a slow, deliberate gait, his head slightly bowed, his hands clasped, a performance of humility that was so practiced it was insulting. But as the questioning began, the cracks in the facade appeared almost immediately. When the prosecutor confronted him with the inconsistency of his own timelines, the moments where he had claimed to be at home, but digital records placed him in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene, the suspect's voice, once smooth and controlled, began to fray. He started to stutter, to offer convoluted, illogical explanations, his eyes darting toward his defense attorneys with a look of panicked betrayal. The courtroom was silent, a silence so profound that it seemed to absorb the very sound of the suspect's heartbeat. He was being stripped down, not by force, but by the relentless, logical progression of his own lies. The prosecutor wasn't just asking questions. She was building a house of cards and then letting the suspect blow it down with his own frantic efforts to stay consistent. She pushed him on the diary entries, the very ones that had been the pivot point of the trial, and watched as his defense crumbled under the weight of his own words. He tried to claim the entries were fiction, a creative exercise, but the prosecutor countered with the intimate, agonizing details of the victim's life that had been recorded in those pages, details that no one could have known unless they had been watching him, documenting his habits and orchestrating his end. The suspect's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. The mask was not just slipping, it was completely disintegrating. As the suspect's testimony progressed, the focus shifted from the crime to the man himself. He became defensive, then aggressive, his tone shifting from the humble, quiet neighbor to something harsher, colder, and more transparently arrogant. He began to speak of the victim not as a person, but as an obstacle, a hurdle that had to be cleared for his own path to be open. It was a moment of horrific honesty that the prosecution had been hunting for since the investigation reopened. He didn't even realize he had said it, but the room heard it, a clear, unambiguous admission of the motive that had fueled the 19 years of silence. The gallery erupted into a murmur, a sound of profound shock and deep-seated, visceral anger. The judge hammered the gavel, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard it. The truth had found its way out, through the very lips of the man who had spent nearly 2 decades trying to bury it. Following the suspect's testimony, the trial seemed to reach a saturation point of emotion and evidence. The defense team, now visibly shaken, withdrew their remaining witnesses, their strategy of humanization having been decisively incinerated by their own client. The court adjourned early, the atmosphere feeling as though a great, heavy curtain had been lifted. The detectives who had been the ones to push for the reinvestigation, who had spent their careers carrying the burden of the 2005 file, were seen talking in the hallway, their voices hushed, their expressions a mix of profound relief and a haunting, lingering sadness. They had done it. They had brought the ghost into the light, and they had forced the truth to stand in the middle of the room, naked and undeniable. But there was no cheering, no high-fives. There was only the quiet, heavy realization that the trial had successfully unmasked a monster, but it hadn't and never could undo the damage of that night in 2005. As I walked out of the building that evening, the sky was a deep, bruised purple, the lights of the city flickering on like a constellation of indifferent stars. The town, which had spent nearly 20 years living under the cloud of the unsolved mystery, was now being forced to deal with the harsh, cold clarity of the resolution. I could see the residents standing on their balconies, watching the street, their conversations clearly revolving around the events of the day. The trial had forced them to engage with the darkness, and now that the monster had been identified, the town had to figure out how to live with the knowledge of what had been happening right under their noses. It was a sobering, necessary process of reevaluation. They weren't just thinking about the victim or the suspect anymore. They were thinking about themselves, their neighbors, and the very concept of the world they had built and thought was safe. The trial would resume in the morning for closing arguments, but the essence of the case had already been decided in the moments of the suspect's collapse on the stand. The 2005 cold case was a closed book in all but the final, formal verdict. I returned to my hotel, the silence of the room feeling different than it had the night before. No longer a heavy, oppressive thing, but a clean, open space waiting for the final word. I lay in the dark, thinking about the diary, the mask, and the way the truth had finally clawed its way out of the suspect's throat. It was a reminder that no secret, no matter how carefully constructed, can withstand the relentless, erosive power of the light. The long, agonizing wait was finally nearing its conclusion, and the sense of peace that was beginning to settle over the town felt like the quiet that follows a great, cleansing rain. The ghost of 2005 was finally, officially put to rest, and as I drifted off to sleep, I felt the profound weight of a 19-year-old debt finally being marked as paid. Tomorrow would be the day the story would be closed, and the town, having finally looked into the mirror and seen the truth, would be free to walk into the future without the shadow of the past dictating their steps. The long, cold night was nearly over, and for the first time, the dawn felt like a true beginning, not just the start of another day of searching for answers that were never going to come. The justice that had been promised to the victim's family, to the investigators, and to the very idea of the law itself, was waiting just beyond the next sunrise, and the town, battle-hardened and weary, was finally ready to receive it. The final morning of the trial dawned with a cold, relentless clarity that mirrored the courtroom's atmosphere, a stark, unforgiving illumination of a reality that could no longer be denied. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, a suffocating congregation of locals, members of the press, and the tireless investigators who had walked the long, winding road of the 2005 case. As the judge took the bench, the sound of the gavel seemed to echo with the finality of a bell tolling for the long-buried past. The prosecution, led by a lawyer whose unwavering focus had become the stuff of local legend, rose to deliver the closing argument. Her voice was not a roar, but a surgical instrument, systematically dismantling the remnants of the suspect's defense and weaving together the disparate threads of evidence into a singular, inescapable rope of culpability. She spoke of the 2005 night as if it were still happening, painting a tableau of the victim's final moments that moved the gallery to a collective, stifled sob. She transitioned from that visceral, heartbreaking opening into the cold, technical mechanics of the investigation, laying out the timeline, the forensic links, and the damning, undeniable truth of the motive that had been unearthed on the stand. It was a narrative of profound betrayal, not just of the victim, but of the community that had harbored the killer, fed him, and trusted him. She challenged the jury to look past the mask of the neighbor and recognize the reality of the predator. Every sentence was a weight, adding to the mountain of accountability that now pressed down upon the defendant. The jury sat in a trance, their eyes tracking the prosecutor's every gesture as she brought the 19-year-old cold case into the stark, uncompromising light of the present day. When the defense stood to make their final plea, it was an exercise in diminishing returns. They attempted to evoke the abstract concepts of doubt and the fallibility of time, but their voices seemed to lack the resonance of truth. They were fighting against the crushing momentum of the prosecution's case, against the diary, the digital trail, and the defendant's own collapse on the stand. It was an argument made out of thin air, a desperate effort to maintain a narrative that had been decisively debunked by the reality of the facts. As they spoke, the suspect remained a picture of total, hollowed-out resignation, his eyes no longer scanning for an exit, but seemingly focused on the abyss of his own future. He was a man who had already been convicted by the sheer presence of the truth, the verdict already written on the faces of the people who watched him. The deliberation phase, which had been anticipated for weeks as a marathon of agonizing debate, proved to be far shorter than anyone expected. The jury, a group of people who had been transformed by the weight of the evidence and the gravity of their role, were not looking for excuses. They were looking for the resolution that the community had been starved of for nearly 2 decades. The hours spent in the sequestered room were not hours of hesitation, but hours of consolidation, of assembling the final, definitive narrative that would close the book on the 2005 murder. The town outside, meanwhile, was in a state of suspended animation. Business in the downtown core slowed to a halt. The schools went quiet, and the local airwaves were filled with a tense, expectant silence that felt like the stillness before a massive storm. When the news finally broke that the jury had reached a verdict, it was not an announcement, but a ripple, a wave of energy that moved through the town with the speed of electricity. People rushed to the courthouse, their faces a mixture of dread, hope, and an overwhelming desire for closure. The hallway became a frantic, crowded corridor of whispered speculation. The victim's family, who had carried the burden of the unsolved case as a private, aching constant in their lives, arrived with a collective strength that was breathtaking. They stood in the front row, a fortress of resilience, their presence the moral anchor of the entire trial. The air in the courtroom was so charged with the potential of the coming verdict that it was difficult to take a full, deep breath. The jury filed back in, their movements synchronized and grave. As they took their seats, the defendant was brought out, his posture sagging as if the gravity of the room had physically increased. The judge, whose presence had been the steady, quiet center of the entire proceeding, asked for the verdict. The foreman, a man whose hands were steady, rose and began to speak. The word he uttered, guilty, did not sound like a sound. It sounded like the shutting of a heavy iron door. It was the final, definitive end to 19 years of uncertainty. The room seemed to fracture, the tension releasing in a collective, audible gasp that rippled through the gallery. The family of the victim held onto each other, their tears not those of despair, but of a profound, shattering release. The suspect, for his part, did not scream or protest. He didn't look at the gallery or the family. He simply stared at the floor, his entire physical being a portrait of a man who had finally been relieved of the terrible, crushing burden of his own deceit. The secret he had held for 19 years was finally out, the weight of it transferred from his shoulders to the cold, hard records of the justice system. The detectives who had been standing in the back of the room shared a look, a brief, silent acknowledgement of the long, grueling work that had led to this singular, monumental moment. They had started with a file that had no future, a cold case that felt like a permanent failure, and they had, through sheer, unrelenting persistence, brought the truth into the light. The judge began the process of sentencing, the words flowing with a bureaucratic rhythm that belied their immense, life-altering impact. The sentence was life, the maximum, the inescapable reality for a man who had stolen a future and built a facade of virtue on the ruins of another's existence. It was a sentence that would be served in a place where the suburban mask of the neighbor would be irrelevant, a place where he would be defined only by the gravity of his crime. As the bailiffs moved in to lead him away, the suspect paused, looking back toward the gallery one last time, but there was nothing there for him. No sympathy, no anger, only the cold, hard reality of the justice he had spent 2 decades trying to outrun. As the courthouse began to empty, the feeling in the streets was one of profound, dazed relief. The town was beginning to realize that the nightmare of 2005 was no longer a haunting, present reality. It was now a part of their history, a painful chapter that had been properly closed. The news vans were already beginning to dismantle their equipment. The reporters were turning toward the next story, and the town was starting the slow, difficult process of reclaiming its identity. The murder, which had defined their collective consciousness, had been stripped of its mystery and reduced to a matter of law. It was no longer a ghost. It was a fact, a piece of knowledge that they would now have to learn to live with, but one that no longer had the power to terrorize them in the dark. I stayed until the very end, watching the last of the participants leave the building. The courthouse, which had been the site of so many intense, life-defining moments, was finally settling back into the quiet, mundane existence of a government building. The 2005 cold case was gone, replaced by the silence of a file now fully recorded and sealed. As I walked out into the cool, night air, I felt the sheer weight of the story I had been witnessing. It was a story about the persistence of memory, the cruelty of a secret, and the vital, necessary power of the truth. We had traveled through the darkest corridors of the human experience, and we had come out on the other side. The long, agonizing wait was finally, irrevocably over, and as I walked toward the distant glow of the city, the future felt, for the first time in 19 years, like an open, uncharted, and entirely honest path. The mystery of 2005 was at rest, and the town, for all its scars, was finally, truly, moving forward into the light of a new, authentic beginning. The immediate aftermath of the sentencing was not the joyous celebration one might expect in a fictional drama, but rather a profound, heavy silence that descended upon the town like a thick winter fog. It was a silence born of exhaustion, of 19 years of held breath finally being released all at once. The courthouse, once the vibrant, chaotic heart of a community-wide exorcism, now stood as a quiet monolith of stone and glass, its purpose fulfilled. I found myself walking its perimeter in the days that followed, the grass still holding the imprints of the satellite vans and the heavy foot traffic of a town in mourning and in search of truth. The 2005 case, which had functioned as a phantom limb, an aching void in the community's collective conscience, had been effectively amputated, but the stump remained. A reminder of the trauma and the long, agonizing wait for the scalpel of justice to finally arrive. The detectives, who had been the architects of this resolution, were experiencing the strange, disorienting sensation of mission accomplished. They returned to their desks that were no longer buried under the mountain of paperwork, evidence bags, and cold case files that had defined their existence. They spoke in hushed tones about the quiet, the lack of ringing phones, and the bizarre sensation of being able to go home without the ghost of the 2005 victim whispering in the back of their minds. They had been defined by the mystery, their reputations and their sleepless nights tethered to a file that seemed destined to remain unsolved. Now, they were just officers again, and the transition felt like stepping from a high-speed vehicle into a dead-stop stillness. It was a vocational decompression that was as difficult as the investigation itself. They knew they would soon be assigned to new cases, new mysteries, and new human tragedies, but they would always be the team that solved the 2005 case, a badge of honor that carried with it the heavy, indelible memory of everything they had witnessed. For the victim's family, the post-trial period was a journey through a landscape of raw, unvarnished emotions. They had reached the destination they had sought for nearly 2 decades, but the destination looked nothing like the paradise of resolution they had once imagined. They were still missing their loved one, and the absence had only been amplified by the clarity of the trial. They had spent years holding on to the hope that a name, a motive, and a conviction would make the world right again, but they were learning the hard, painful truth. Justice is not a cure for grief. It is only the removal of the uncertainty that allows grief to finally breathe. They were beginning to navigate the quiet of their homes, the holidays, and the milestones that had been hollowed out by the murder, but this time, they weren't haunted by the fear that the killer was walking free, unrecognized and unpunished. They had been given the gift of the truth, even if the truth was a cold, hard stone that had to be carried. The town itself began the slow, delicate work of social integration. The revelation that their neighbor, the helpful, smiling man who helped shovel the snow and kept his hedges trimmed, was actually a cold-blooded killer, had done more than just shock them. It had fundamentally dismantled their social fabric. People were more reserved, more observant, and more conscious of the masks that were worn in their daily lives. The neighborliness that had once been the town's pride was now seasoned with a new, necessary level of skepticism. They had learned the hard way that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones held behind a closed, ordinary-looking door. They weren't becoming a cynical, hateful community, but they were becoming a more honest one. They were no longer willing to settle for the surface appearance of things, a change that felt like a permanent, foundational shift in how they interacted with one another. The media, as fickle as a mountain wind, had long since packed its bags and moved on to the next tragedy, the next sensational headline, the next case of the century. The town was left with the reality of its own story, a narrative that belonged only to them. They didn't need the validation of the national news cycle anymore. They had the truth, they had the record, and they had the peace of knowing that the 2005 chapter was officially, irrevocably closed. I spent my time interviewing the residents, capturing their reflections as the shock began to fade into the deeper, quieter currents of history. An elderly woman who had lived on the same street as the victim told me that for the first time in 19 years, she felt she could walk past the house without looking over her shoulder. It was a small, profound statement, one that captured the essence of the freedom the town had been granted, the freedom to live without the low-level, pervasive fear of a shadow that wasn't there. The suspect, tucked away in the deepest recesses of the state prison, became a non-person. The world outside, the town he had manipulated, and the life he had stolen were moving on without him. He was a relic of his own ambition, a man who had traded his humanity for a sense of control and had lost everything in the process. His name would eventually fade from the public consciousness, his crime relegated to a line item in a textbook or a footnote in a true crime documentary, but for the community, he would always be the man who turned their quiet, ordinary life into a theater of horror. And that, in its own way, was the final, perfect justice. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be the architect of something significant, and he had succeeded. Only not as the mastermind he had imagined himself to be, but as a cautionary, pathetic symbol of how small, petty, and ultimately hollow his motives had truly been. I found myself returning to the study, the room where the 911 call had originated all those years ago. The new owners had renovated the space, stripping away the old wallpaper and installing modern fixtures, but the room itself held the echoes. Standing there, I didn't feel the chill of a haunting. I felt the stillness of a room that had finally been allowed to just be a room. The tragedy that had happened there had been contextualized, processed, and finalized by the law. It was no longer a focal point for the town's trauma. The narrative of the 2005 murder had been written, edited, and put to rest. The mystery had been hollowed out, leaving only the mundane reality of a crime and its resolution. It was a lesson in the power of persistence, the persistence of the investigators, the persistence of the family, and the persistence of the truth itself, which, no matter how deeply it is suppressed, will always, eventually, break through the surface of the lie. As I prepared to leave the town for the final time, I sat on a bench in the park, looking out over the playground where the children were running, laughing, and living their lives, entirely unburdened by the memory of 2005. They were the future, the ones who would grow up in a town that was no longer defined by its shadows. For them, the 2005 case would be nothing more than a story, an old tale of a time before they knew the world, and that was the true, final, and most profound success of the entire ordeal. The town had successfully protected its future by finally confronting its past. The long, dark night of 19 years had been exhausting. It had left its mark on every soul who had lived through it, but it had ended. The sun was up, the air was clear, and the town was once again a place where a Tuesday was just a Tuesday, and a knock at the door was just a neighbor, not a ghost. My journey had taken me through the darkest, most complicated, and most revealing aspects of human nature. I had seen the heights of endurance and the depths of malice. I had seen how a secret could be a poison, and how the truth could be both a blade and a bomb. I had seen a town be broken and be rebuilt, and I had seen how the legal process, for all its agonizing, bureaucratic slowness, could eventually, inevitably, serve the cause of the truth. It was a story that I would carry with me, a narrative that had changed my understanding of what it means to live in a community and what it means to demand justice. The 2005 cold case was finished, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. And as I turned my car toward the highway, the last glimpse of the town in my rearview mirror wasn't of a haunted place, but of a quiet, ordinary community that was finally, truly moving on, ready to write the next, unburdened chapter of its own history. The long, agonizing wait was finally and definitively over. The finality of the trial had settled over the town like a gentle snowfall, smoothing out the jagged edges of the past 19 years and creating a landscape that felt, for the first time, clean and navigable. The courthouse was no longer the epicenter of public life. It had retreated into its role as a quiet, stoic monument to the law, its halls now filled with the hum of routine bureaucracy rather than the electric tension of a reckoning. I spent my final week in the area not as a reporter chasing a lead, but as an observer documenting the slow, deliberate process of healing. The town was reclaiming itself, piece by piece, from the long shadow that the 2005 cold case had cast. Every time I walked the streets, I sensed a subtle shift in the air, a lightening of the atmosphere, a dissolution of the paranoia that had once made every stranger seem like a suspect and every closed door like a vault of secrets. One of the most striking aspects of this post-trial period was the way the community began to speak about the victim. For nearly 2 decades, he had been a symbol of the unsolved, a figure shrouded in the mystery of his own ending. Now, he was being remembered for the life he had lived before the darkness took him. I attended a small, informal memorial held in a public park, where friends and acquaintances shared stories that had nothing to do with the night of the murder and everything to do with the man himself, his love for old literature, his slightly awkward sense of humor, the way he would spend hours helping his neighbors with their garden projects. It was a reclaiming of his humanity, a way of insisting that he was not just a case file or a forensic puzzle, but a person whose existence had mattered long before the 2005 nightmare began. The family, present at the event, seemed to draw strength from these shared memories, their grief finally untethered from the cold, clinical pursuit of justice. The detectives, now fully transitioned back to their daily routines, offered a perspective that was equally illuminating. I sat down with the lead investigator one evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across his office. He spoke not of the tactics or the forensic breakthroughs that had solved the case, but of the profound, quiet relief that came with the end of the pursuit. He described the 19 years of carrying the 2005 folder as carrying an extra, invisible burden that had influenced every decision he made and every case he touched. Now, he said, he felt lighter, as if he could finally see the path ahead without having to constantly look over his shoulder at the ghost of an unfinished task. He expressed a hope that the techniques they had perfected during the investigation, the way they had utilized ancestral databases and cross-referenced decades of fragmented data, would serve as a blueprint for other departments struggling with their own cold cases. It was a legacy of persistence, a testament to the idea that no file is ever truly dead as long as there is the will to keep digging. The suspect, hidden away in a world of cinderblock and restricted schedules, was essentially a ghost in a machine. I had heard reports from prison officials that he remained a shadow of the man he had been, his existence now reduced to the stark, unavoidable reality of his confinement. There was no attempt at bravado, no sense of pride in his long-held secret. There was only the crushing, relentless boredom and the isolation that had once been his protection and was now his prison. The irony was not lost on the community. The man who had spent 19 years obsessively controlling every detail of his environment was now entirely at the mercy of a system that controlled every breath he took. He was a cautionary tale in every possible sense, a reminder of the futility of trying to build a life on a foundation of hidden evil. The archives of the 2005 case, once a disorganized, chaotic mountain of conflicting theories and dead-end leads, had been reorganized into a final, coherent volume. I was allowed a final look at the documents, the police reports, the witness statements, the forensic analysis, the diary entries that had been the pivot point of the trial. It was a sobering experience to hold the history of the case in my hands, to see the physical manifestation of 19 years of human effort, frustration, and eventual triumph. It was a record of the truth, stripped of all its mystery, standing naked and unassailable. I thought about the sheer number of people whose lives had been redirected by these papers, the detectives who had grown old chasing the ghost, the family who had spent the best years of their lives waiting for this moment, and the suspect who had built his life on the hollowed-out center of this murder. As I took my final walk through the neighborhood where the crime had occurred, the house itself was undergoing its own evolution. The new owners were doing work on the front porch, the sound of hammers ringing out in the clear, cool air. It was a noise of restoration, a sound of life continuing in the wake of tragedy. I felt a sense of profound closure that I hadn't expected. The case was solved, the suspect was contained, and the community was healing. The long, agonizing wait was finally, irrevocably over. The town was not the same place it had been in 2005, and it never would be again. It was harder, more skeptical, more aware of its own shadows, but it was also more resilient and more committed to the pursuit of the truth. I realized then that the story I had been covering wasn't just about a murder or the resolution of a cold case. It was about the fundamental human drive to make sense of the senseless. It was about the way we hold onto the threads of the truth, even when they seem hopelessly tangled, and the way we refuse to let the darkness win. The story of the 2005 murder was a piece of history now, a narrative that would belong to the archives and the textbooks, but for the people who had lived it, it was the story of how they had found their way home through a long, dark night. As I reached my car and prepared to leave the town behind, I took one last look at the quiet, ordinary streets. They didn't feel haunted anymore. They felt like a place where life was happening, where the future was being written, and where the past was finally, correctly, held in its proper place. My final report would not be about the mechanics of the crime or the brilliance of the investigation, but about the resilience of the community and the enduring power of the truth. I had started this journey with a series of questions, and I was leaving with a set of answers that were as final as they were sobering. The truth was not the comforting, tidy conclusion I had once expected. It was a complex, painful, and often ugly reality. But it was the truth, and in the end, that was the only thing that could allow them to move forward. The long, agonizing wait was over. The ghost of 2005 had been exorcised, the records were sealed, and the town was free. I drove away, the road ahead opening up before me, and for the first time, I felt the lightness that comes from knowing the mystery is over. The long, cold night had ended, and the dawn was as bright, as honest, and as promising as any I had ever seen. The 2005 case was history, and history, finally, had been told in its entirety, leaving nothing behind but the quiet, steady progress of a life that was finally, truly, its own. The conclusion of the legal saga did not immediately erase the memory of the 2005 case. Instead, it ushered in a period of intense, collective retrospection that permeated every facet of the community's existence. The town, having lived for nearly 2 decades in the shadow of a mystery that seemed both insurmountable and omnipresent, was now grappling with the reality of its resolution. The silence that had once been filled with speculation and fear was now replaced by a more nuanced, contemplative quiet. People were not just talking about the murder anymore, they were talking about the fragility of their own perceptions. They were analyzing how they had moved through their days, trusting a man who had orchestrated the very thing they feared, all while maintaining the veneer of a productive, contributing neighbor. This self-examination was the final, necessary piece of the community's healing process, a way to ensure that the ghost of the 2005 case would not be replaced by a new, equally debilitating suspicion. In the local schools, teachers began to integrate lessons on forensic science and the nature of the criminal justice system into their curricula, using the now-concluded case as a sober example of the importance of vigilance, evidence-based reasoning, and the slow but inexorable march of justice. It was a way of grounding the trauma in something educational, something that could provide the next generation with the tools to understand the darkness that had once threatened their peace. Meanwhile, at the local community center, a memorial fund in the victim's name was established, aimed at supporting families affected by long-term, unresolved tragedies. It was a way of turning the long-standing pain of the community into a resource, a way of ensuring that the victim would be remembered not just as a name on a police report, but as a source of strength and support for others who found themselves in similar, agonizing situations. The shift from mourning to action was a clear indicator of a town that had finally, successfully, stepped out from under the cloud. I spent my final days in the region documenting the physical changes that were being made to the town's landscape, a new park, a renovated community library, and the quiet, steady improvements to the infrastructure that had been neglected during the long, preoccupied years of the investigation. It felt as though the town was physically manifesting its desire to build a future that was not defined by the past. The house where the murder had occurred, now freshly painted and occupied by a young family with no knowledge of its dark history, stood as a symbol of this transition. It was no longer a crime scene, it was a home. The trauma had been scrubbed from its walls, not just by the new coat of paint, but by the passage of time and the finality of the court's verdict. The life that was being lived inside was a testament to the fact that, eventually, even the most persistent shadows are eclipsed by the light of the present. The investigative team, meanwhile, was experiencing a profound sense of closure that had been 19 years in the making. They had hosted a small, private dinner to commemorate the end of the case, a gathering not of celebration, but of reflection. They spoke of the colleagues who had moved on, retired, or passed away during the long, exhausting search, and they acknowledged the contribution of every person who had touched the file over the last 2 decades. It was a recognition that the resolution was the result of a cumulative effort, a relay race where the baton had been passed from one generation of investigators to the next. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that the case had been a singular challenge that had pushed them to the limits of their professional and personal capacities, and that the satisfaction of the verdict was a reward that they had truly earned. They were no longer the cold case team. They were just professionals who had done their duty, and that was enough. The suspect, now fully integrated into the prison's internal structure, was becoming a footnote. His influence, which had once been a source of terror and curiosity, had been utterly neutralized. The world outside, the town he had manipulated, and the life he had stolen were moving on without him. He was a relic of his own ambition, a man who had traded his humanity for a sense of control and had lost everything in the process. His name would eventually fade from the public consciousness, his crime relegated to a line item in a textbook or a footnote in a true crime documentary, but for the community, he would always be the man who turned their quiet, ordinary life into a theater of horror. And that, in its own way, was the final, perfect justice. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be the architect of something significant, and he had succeeded. Only not as the mastermind he had imagined himself to be, but as a cautionary, pathetic symbol of how small, petty, and ultimately hollow his motives had truly been. As I looked back at the town from the vantage point of the highway, I realized that my own journey had come to a definitive end. I had entered the region as an outsider looking for a story, and I was leaving as someone who had been deeply moved by the tenacity and the grace of a community that had refused to let its history be defined by a single, senseless act of violence. I had seen how the truth could be a transformative power, how it could tear down the walls of deception and build a foundation for a new, honest beginning. I had learned that justice, while often delayed, is an essential, life-affirming process that allows a community to reclaim its own story. The 2005 cold case was a closed book, a completed chapter, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. The final report that I would file would be a testament to this resilience, a story not about the crime, but about the people who had refused to give up, the detectives who had chased the shadows, the family who had held on to their hope, and the community that had found the strength to look at the truth and move forward. The long, agonizing wait was finished. The ghost of 2005 was officially, irrevocably put to rest, and the town was free. I drove away, the road ahead opening up before me, and for the first time, I felt the lightness that comes from knowing the mystery is over. The long, cold night had ended, and the dawn was as bright, as honest, and as promising as any I had ever seen. The story of the 2005 case was finished, but the story of the town was only just beginning, a new chapter that would be written, day by day, in the light of the truth, unburdened by the secrets of the past. The mystery was gone, but the town remained, a place of peace, of progress, and of the quiet, enduring strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you have come from. The long wait was over, and the future, finally, was wide open. The echoes of the 2005 case were finally fading, not into oblivion, but into the quiet, sturdy fabric of history. As I sat in the local cafe, the same one where I had spent countless hours over the past weeks listening to the murmurs of the townsfolk, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. The hushed, conspiratorial tones had been replaced by the normal, mundane chatter of daily existence, complaints about the weather, local school board politics, and the price of coffee. The cold case was no longer a heavy, pervasive presence that sucked the air out of the room. It was a topic that had been folded into the town's collective narrative, like a ghost story that had finally been explained. There was a sense of profound psychological stabilization, a collective exhale that had lasted months, and now, the town was finding its rhythm again. It was a rhythm defined not by the shadow of a 19-year-old murder, but by the tangible, ordinary pulse of the present. The detectives, once the protagonists of this long, grueling saga, were also finding their footing in the post-case world. I met with the chief of the cold case unit one last time, in a small office that felt significantly less cluttered than it had months ago. The stacks of evidence boxes were gone, replaced by the mundane administrative tasks that constitute the majority of police work. We talked about the nature of persistence, about the fine line between dedication and obsession, and about the rare, fleeting moments of satisfaction that make the long, frustrating years of investigation worthwhile. He expressed a sentiment that resonated with everything I had observed, that the resolution of a case like 2005's wasn't just about the verdict, it was about the restoration of order to a chaotic world. It was about confirming the fundamental human belief that actions have consequences, that the truth is not a negotiable commodity, and that no matter how cleverly a secret is buried, the process of law will eventually unearth it. For the victim's family, the passage of time had begun to provide a different kind of clarity. They were no longer the figures of tragedy they had been at the start of the trial. They were simply a family, once again, dealing with the ups and downs of life. The resolution had given them the freedom to mourn without the distraction of the unknown. They could now look back at their loved one's life as a complete, coherent story, rather than a narrative that had been abruptly and cruelly cut off in the dark. They had found their peace, a quiet, internal reconciliation that was far more potent than any public statement could ever be. I watched them from a distance at a community event, saw the way they interacted with their neighbors, the way they seemed unburdened, and it was the most powerful testament to the necessity of the justice they had pursued for so long. They had survived, and in surviving, they had become the architects of their own healing. The legal system, which had been the arena for this conflict, was already shifting its focus to other matters. The judge had moved on to the next docket, the lawyers were preparing for their next motions, and the machinery of justice was churning forward, indifferent to the personal narratives it consumed. This was the nature of the beast. It was a relentless, grinding process that didn't stop for tears or catharsis. But for those involved, the detectives, the family, the community, the 2005 cold case was a life-defining event. It was a bookmark in their history, a point of reference that would organize the rest of their lives. When they spoke of the years that followed, they would always have to account for the shadow cast by that night in 2005. It was the before and the after that would always be the heartbeat of their perspective. I took one final drive through the residential streets, the ones that had been the backdrop for the suspect's 19-year deception. It was a mundane, suburban landscape, but looking at it now, with the knowledge of what had truly occurred, it felt like a different world. The house that had once been the center of the mystery was just a structure of wood and brick, and the streets were just thoroughfares for the daily commute. The fear that had once been mapped onto these streets had been replaced by a more grounded, realistic understanding of the world. The town was no longer a place where a monster could hide in plain sight. It was a place that had learned to keep its eyes open. That awareness, that newfound clarity, was the greatest shield they could ever have. The archive, that dark, silent repository of 19 years of frustration, was finally closed. I realized then that my own journey had come to a definitive end. I had entered the region as an outsider looking for a story, and I was leaving as someone who had been deeply moved by the tenacity and the grace of a community that had refused to let its history be defined by a single, senseless act of violence. I had seen how the truth could be a transformative power, how it could tear down the walls of deception and build a foundation for a new, honest beginning. I had learned that justice, while often delayed, is an essential, life-affirming process that allows a community to reclaim its own story. The 2005 cold case was a closed book, a completed chapter, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. The final report that I would file would be a testament to this resilience, a story not about the crime, but about the people who had refused to give up, the detectives who had chased the shadows, the family who had held on to their hope, and the community that had found the strength to look at the truth and move forward. The long, agonizing wait was finished. The ghost of 2005 was officially, irrevocably put to rest, and the town was free. I drove away, the road ahead opening up before me, and for the first time, I felt the lightness that comes from knowing the mystery is over. The long, cold night had ended, and the dawn was as bright, as honest, and as promising as any I had ever seen. The story of the 2005 case was finished, but the story of the town was only just beginning, a new chapter that would be written, day by day, in the light of the truth, unburdened by the secrets of the past. The mystery was gone, but the town remained, a place of peace, of progress, and of the quiet, enduring strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you have come from. The long wait was over, and the future, finally, was wide open. As I watched the town disappear in the rearview mirror, I realized that I would never forget the silence that had haunted the house for 19 years, and the silence that now, finally, felt like a clean, blank slate. The 2005 cold case would always be part of my own narrative, a reminder of the power of truth and the necessity of justice, but the town itself was finally liberated from its grip. They were no longer victims of the past. They were the authors of their own future. And that, in the final analysis, was the only justice that truly mattered. The road ahead was long, but it was clear, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, there were no ghosts standing in the way. The dawn had broken, the air was clear, and the world was once again full of the simple, unadorned promise of a new day. The finality of the resolution had settled into the town's marrow, no longer a sharp, painful sting but a dull, grounding hum that allowed for the slow, inevitable return to normalcy. I spent my final days walking the perimeter of the town, not with the frenetic energy of an investigator or the intrusive curiosity of a reporter, but with the quiet, reflective pace of someone who had borne witness to a fundamental change. The house, that silent vessel of 19 years of secrets, was now occupied by a young family whose children played in the yard without the faintest notion of the history that once seeped through the floorboards. It was a beautiful, jarring sight, the erasure of trauma not through forgetting, but through the simple, persistent act of living. The garden, once an overgrown, neglected plot, was vibrant with life, a living testament to the fact that time is the only true equalizer. In the downtown district, the local businesses that had weathered the long, suffocating storm of the cold case were finally thriving. The coffee shop, which had been the unofficial headquarters for the town's rumors and fears during the trial, was now a place for the mundane, cheerful exchange of community news. The fear that had once acted as a barrier between neighbors had dissolved, replaced by a more grounded, realistic sense of communal connection. They were a community that had seen their own dark reflection in the trial of the neighbor-turned-predator, and they had come out the other side with a more honest, if less naive, understanding of what it means to be a neighbor. They had looked at the monster in their midst and, in doing so, had learned to better value the humanity in the people who actually stood beside them. It was a painful, expensive lesson, but it was one they had truly learned. The archive, once the tomb where the 2005 case lay in suspended animation, was now just a room of documents. I sat in that quiet space one last time, reflecting on the sheer physical weight of the evidence that had been necessary to break the silence. Thousands of pages, hundreds of hours of interviews, decades of forensic analysis, all of it had been required to tip the scales toward justice. It was a reminder that justice is not an abstract, automatic force. It is something that must be earned, piece by agonizing piece, by the persistent, unblinking dedication of those who refuse to accept the darkness as the final word. The detectives had left their desks, the files had been boxed, and the room had returned to its original, unremarkable purpose. The case was gone, but the legacy of the effort remained, a quiet, powerful statement about the resilience of the search for truth. I had several long conversations with the community leaders, the ones who had held the town together through the long, agonizing years of the unsolved status. They spoke about the burden of the past as a weight they had been collectively carrying, one that had bent their posture and limited their vision. Now, they were standing taller, looking forward to the future with a sense of agency they hadn't felt in nearly 2 decades. They weren't ignoring the murder. They were incorporating it into their understanding of themselves. They were a town that had survived, and that survival had given them a new, hardened, and more capable identity. They were no longer the people who were waiting for answers. They were the people who had fought for them, earned them, and integrated them into the story they were now continuing to write. The suspect, deep in the isolation of the correctional system, was a non-factor in the current life of the town. His story, once a source of terror, had been stripped of its power. He was an object lesson in the ultimate failure of malice. He had tried to become the central, governing force of a life he had ended, but instead, he had become the subject of an inevitable, systemic erasure. He had lost everything, his freedom, his reputation, and his ability to influence the world, and he had ended up exactly where he belonged, on the outside of the life he had tried so hard to conquer. His existence, now limited to the stark, repetitive routine of the institution, was the ultimate, anticlimactic end to the 19-year-long narrative of his own hubris. The town didn't hate him anymore, not because they had forgiven him, but because they had finally stopped fearing him. And for a predator, there is no greater defeat than becoming entirely, utterly irrelevant to the people he had once held in his thrall. The victim's family, who had stood at the center of the storm for all these years, were finally beginning to step out of the shadows. I caught a glimpse of them at a local event, living their lives with a quiet, persistent grace. They were not the family of the victim anymore. They were people who had moved on to the next chapter. They had their own stories, their own joys, and their own future, and it was a pleasure to see them reclaim the agency they had been robbed of for so long. They had shown a strength that was beyond measure, a capacity to endure the worst of human experience and still find the path back to the light. The resolution of the case hadn't given them back their loved one, but it had given them back the ability to move forward, and that was the ultimate, final gift of the justice they had so tirelessly sought. As I took my final walk through the town, I realized that I had become a part of their story, even if only in the peripheral, observational way of a stranger. I had carried their burden for a moment, and in doing so, I had learned more about the human condition than I had ever expected. The 2005 cold case was a chapter in my own life as well, a definitive, sobering reminder of the things that can happen in the dark and the immense effort required to bring them into the light. I had seen the transformation from mystery to truth and from fear to understanding, and it had fundamentally altered my own perspective on the world. I left the town feeling a strange, profound sense of gratitude, not for the crime, but for the clarity that had eventually followed it. My final report would be a reflection on this journey, a testament to the fact that no matter how long the shadows may be, they are never permanent. I would write about the detectives, the family, and the community, but mostly I would write about the truth, how it is the only thing that can truly set us free, even when the cost of finding it is higher than anyone ever imagined. The 2005 case was finished, and the town was free. I turned my car onto the highway, the road stretching out before me, unburdened and clear. The long night of 19 years had ended, and the future, finally, was bright, open, and entirely theirs to claim. The story of the town was being written, and for the first time, the pages were clean, the ink was wet, and the truth was the foundation for everything that was yet to come. The long wait was over, and as I drove into the dawn, the silence of the night was replaced by the steady, hopeful, and inevitable rhythm of a world that had finally, rightfully, regained its balance. The truth had finally arrived, and it was enough. The final, closing chapter of the 2005 saga arrived not with a fanfare or the tolling of bells, but with the quiet, profound realization that the narrative had reached its natural horizon. Standing on the edge of the town, looking back at the clustered rooftops bathed in the golden, indifferent glow of a late afternoon sun, I understood that this place would forever be split into two distinct realities: the town that lived under the suffocating, unvoiced terror of a secret, and the town that now stood upright, unburdened by the phantom of a cold case that had finally been laid to rest. The transition was complete, a total realignment of the community's center of gravity. What had been a mystery that defined them, a dark, gravitational pull that exerted its influence over every suburban aspiration and every quiet night, had been transformed into history. History, unlike mystery, is something we can study, acknowledge, and most importantly, leave behind. I walked the streets one last time, observing the architecture of a community that had undergone a structural change in its very spirit. The house where the 2005 tragedy occurred, the house that had served as the physical anchor for the ghost, was no longer a destination of morbid curiosity. The new owners, a young couple, were tending to a flower bed, their movements fluid and optimistic, the kind of domestic rhythm that simply cannot exist in a place where the air is still thick with the residue of a crime. They didn't know the specifics of the 911 call, they didn't know the exact angle at which the desk had been positioned in the study, and they didn't know the name of the man who had sat in the dark for hours, waiting. That ignorance was their greatest gift, the most potent evidence that the trauma had been successfully processed and buried. The house had been reclaimed for the living, and the history was finally, officially, property of the past. The archives, which I had visited so often during this investigation, were finally being sealed. The last of the evidentiary boxes, the ones containing the DNA reports, the forensic photographs, and the long-winding transcripts of the trial, were being moved into the permanent storage of the state judicial record. I watched as a clerk, with a sense of routine that felt almost blasphemous given the weight of the material, stamped the final file as closed. That single, dull thud of the stamp was the punctuation mark on 19 years of chaos. It was the sound of a debt being finally marked as paid, the sound of the system completing the circuit it had started back in 2005. I left the building feeling a strange, hollow sense of peace, a quiet realization that my role as an observer, as a chronicler of this nightmare, had also reached its natural end. In the local tavern, where the truth had been debated in whispers for 2 decades, the conversation had shifted to the trivialities of the present: the high school sports teams, the local real estate market, the upcoming summer festivals. The shift was the true, final verdict. A community cannot heal until it stops talking about its wound, and the town had finally reached that stage. The 2005 case had become the old days, a relic of a time when the town felt smaller, darker, and more vulnerable. They were building a new identity now, one not forged in the crucible of a murder, but in the slow, persistent, and remarkably human process of moving forward. I ordered a drink, sat at the corner of the bar, and listened to the laughter, a sound that, in this place, still felt like a hard-won victory. The detectives, those tireless, aging sentinels of the truth, had largely dispersed. Some had retired to the coast, others were embroiled in the mundane, complex puzzles of new cases, but they all shared the same look of profound, exhausted relief. I had a final coffee with the man who had been the lead on the cold case unit during the final, breakthrough phase. He was looking at his retirement papers, his hands tracing the lines on the documents with a contemplative calm. He didn't speak of the triumph of the arrest or the glory of the conviction. He spoke of the satisfaction of the silence. He said that for 19 years, the case had been a constant, low-level vibration in his skull, a reminder that the world was off balance. Now, for the first time, the vibration had ceased, and he could finally hear his own life again. That, he told me, was the real reward. Not the headline, not the praise, but the simple ability to exist in the world without the weight of an unfinished debt. The family of the victim had long ago retreated into the protective embrace of their private lives, and I made a conscious choice not to intrude on their peace for a final statement. They had given enough of themselves to the public record, enough of their grief to the ravenous maw of the investigation. They were the ones who had earned the right to be forgotten, the right to exist without the label of the victim's family. As I drove past their home, I didn't stop, I didn't look back. I simply kept going, my eyes fixed on the horizon, knowing that for them, the long night had finally, undeniably ended. Their victory was not in the verdict, but in their ability to reclaim the quiet, domestic sanctity of a life that was no longer centered around an empty chair. The town, as I pulled away onto the highway, felt like a ship that had finally navigated the shoals of a treacherous, long-standing storm. The dark clouds that had hung over it for 19 years were being broken apart by the wind, revealing a sky that was clear, vast, and indifferent. I felt a sense of immense gratitude, not for the tragedy, but for the clarity that had eventually followed it. I had been a witness to the final, necessary act of a tragedy that had lasted nearly a generation, and I was leaving with the knowledge that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limits, is capable of an endurance that is as beautiful as it is terrifying. We had journeyed through the darkness, we had examined the depths of human frailty, and we had come out on the other side, battle-scarred but intact, and ready to face whatever the future held with eyes wide open. As the town shrank into a mere point of light in the rearview mirror, I realized that the 2005 cold case was now a part of my own history, a narrative that had changed my understanding of what it means to live in a community and what it means to demand justice. The journey had been exhausting, the cost had been high, and the lessons had been learned in the hardest, most uncompromising way possible, but we had arrived at the truth, and the truth was enough. It was a foundation upon which a future could be built, a stable, honest, and unshakable ground. The long, agonizing wait was finally, and definitively, over. The town was moving forward, and I was moving toward my own future, unburdened by the secrets of the past. The sky in front of me was a brilliant, unfolding canvas of the coming evening, the colors a vivid, hopeful display of the infinite possibilities that lie in the path of the future. The story was closed, the archives were sealed, and the mystery had been hollowed out of existence by the sheer, relentless power of the truth. I accelerated, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a steady, grounding sound, and I felt the weight of the 19 years lift off my own shoulders. I had carried the story, and now, it was free to exist as nothing more than a memory, a painful, haunting memory, but one that no longer had the power to dictate the lives of the people who had survived it. The long, dark night of 2005 was officially at an end, and as I drove into the dusk, the air felt crisp, cool, and filled with the promise of a quiet, unscripted, and entirely honest tomorrow. The mystery was gone, but the truth remained, a steady, unblinking light that illuminated the road ahead for everyone who had been touched by the story. And in that light, I could finally see the path forward, clear, wide open, and free. The long wait was over, and the future was at last, finally, entirely our own.